Welcome to the RD2BE podcast. Each week we sit down with a different registered dietitian nutritionist to showcase the diversity of opportunity in the dietetics profession. Our aim is to dismantle the notion that there is a traditional career path. I'm Carl Barnes, the registered dietitian behind the scenes of RD2BE.
And I am Jenna Warnock, the RD2BE host. Our RD guests share their stories, career paths, and advice to help students like us succeed in the profession. Welcome back to another week of the RD2BE podcast. I'm your host, Jenna, and this week I'm super excited to sit down with an App State alum. I'm pretty biased towards that because we both gone to App State, and this is Bennett Suber. I met her in my MNT class, and she was going over kidney, renal, dialysis, all things like that, and I was like, I gotta have her on the podcast. And so we're sitting down with Miss Bennett Suber. She's a facility administrator and division lead dietitian for Davita Kidney Care. She's been in that company for over 5 years, and she's just been like going up and up in progression, and she just has a lot of great knowledge regarding like renal dialysis and just where dietitians can really shine in that field. And so Bennett, thank you so much for being here to talk about just where you came from, how you got to Davita, and all the things in between. But yeah, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. I'm so excited.
Yes. And so first, we're going to start with just like your studies and what you did at App State. So first, you were a double major in marketing and hospitality and tourism management, but then you went back to school to do nutrition. And so can you kind of go through your process of what made you decide to pivot towards nutrition and where all that began?
Sure. So I started at App in 2007. I was pretty interested in food to begin with. So I had considered like Johnson and Wales, but kind of wanted more of like the traditional college experience. I'd worked in some kitchens, and I was like, I don't know that I want to be like a chef. So I leaned towards hospitality. I was slated to graduate early because I came in with some credits. So I added the marketing double major because I think I kind of had an idea going into graduation in 2011 that I was passionate about the subject matter, but I think I felt like I was lacking the ability to change lives and to like be like a provider and a practitioner. And I wanted to be more involved with like patient health. And so I graduated in 2011 kind of knowing that I wanted to use my degree to some degree, but like I didn't necessarily want to go into like a hotel or a restaurant because the hours are long. You're usually working when everyone else is vacationing. And so, nights, weekends, all of that. And so I think my mom was the one who suggested it. She worked with a lady whose daughter was studying nutrition, and I was very, health conscious. I'd been in athletics as a teen and as a high schooler and a little bit in college. And I was like, oh, that would be perfect. Like you can kind of lean into counseling and helping people, but then you also are like, it's very health conscious, very health focused. And so I took 6 months off after graduation in 2011. I not reapplied, but I met with some advisors and kind of decided saw what classes would transfer, and met with some of the nutrition professors in the program. And basically it was going to take me an additional 2.5 years to kind of work through like all the science classes. As a business major, I took astronomy, I think was my science at the time. So I had to work myself through like the biologies and the chemistries. And so it took me another 2.5 years with like summer school to finish the prereqs for the bachelor's in nutrition. So during that time, I applied through DICUS and was going to get matched to, trying to get matched to a program. I think all of my cohorts in the undergrad program who got matched to Appalachian did pre-select, but I didn't. I was like, I'm going to leave it up to chance. So I think I did like 6 schools, and I matched to App. And so I was like, well, I guess, I'm here another 2 years. So did the combined program. My internship was based in like the Kernersville area of North Carolina. So I did a rotation in bariatric, and at the Moses Cone Hospital in Greensboro, I did a community rotation in with Novant Wellness, just kind of like with outpatient counseling And then I did my food service rotation at a really, really nice continuing care community in Greensboro called Wellspring. And that's kind of how I got my first job. But I definitely pivoted just because I knew hospitality wasn't really going to fill my passion for, helping others, being more health focused, and just feeling like I had more of an impact with, human beings. So
yeah, and it's good. No, yeah, and I'm glad that you were able to kind of see that, you didn't feel like you were stuck, like with the degree that you started with, and you were like, hey, I know that this isn't right. And I feel like with a lot of people, especially with money, they're like, oh, I gotta like wait, work, and then I'll be able to go back to school. But sometimes, it's good that you just bit the bullet, stick through school, and then, now it's like you were able to go out and doing what you want and, pay off those student loans, doing what you want more so.
Right.
And
I think that was my biggest fear was like I was going to end up in a job that like just didn't ignite passion for me. And that just sounded so horrible. And like I could not in good conscience do that. And so at the time, like I think to my family, it seemed kind of like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? You just finished. And I really just wanted to go back. And a lot of the credits transferred because I'd taken things like quantity, food production. I had taken like, a lot of restaurant like theory classes. And so production and food. And so a lot of that did kind of transfer over. So I wasn't starting from scratch. So that encouraged me as well, that like I was already like tangentially, like I'm there. I just, need a little bit more. And just the light at the end of the tunnel of like having a job that I'm in love with was just kind of what motivated me to kind of bite the bullet, like you said, and just, take the leap. So
yeah, and I think because what we've noticed is that there are a lot of like second career, or they kind of, start in one path and then they go to dietetics afterwards. And so, and one thing that we've heard is just people being worried like, oh, my past career, or like, oh, what I started with is going to go to waste, or like, oh, I put all this time into something that I'm not even going to use. But for you, you had 2 degrees first, and then you did a pivot to get like, your third bachelor's degree. And so have you used your first 2 degrees, or like have they helped you at all in what you do? Or because you mentioned that it was good to be tangent to nutrition with your prereqs. And so do you, like, whenever it comes to looking back on your first 2 degrees, like, do you feel like that was useful? Are you glad that that was part of your experience, or just anything like that?
Yeah, so I definitely feel like, especially in the facility administrator role, which I'm in now, I definitely use a lot of like the business practices, which you also learn in the nutrition program as well. You learn about like edible portion and things like that, and it's budget and labor and full-time versus part-time. Like I use a lot of that in my facility administrator role, but I also think it made me more attractive as a candidate for like a leadership role within the dietetics community, because I had kind of like a business background. So like being that liaison between the dietitians of like my region and my division and the operators of my region and my division, it kind of bridged that gap a little bit better. But even when I was a facility dietitian, marketing helped me like really sell a lot of things, right? Like I think when I chose marketing, I thought it was going to be like more graphic design, but what I realized was it was like a lot more of like cold calling, like how do you like hook someone, like how like advertising and like the psychology behind it. That helped me a lot in like selling the renal diet to patients. The hospitality aspect of it, like obviously a lot of it's food based, so that dovetailed really nicely. But the business part of it too, about just kind of like building a culture and how to, customer service, a lot of that is what you do every day in any kind of industry, right? Is like you're selling yourself, and like you're selling the company, or you're selling a business or an idea. And all of that really helped me in this regard, much more than I thought it would.
Yeah, and it's good that you're able to, again, because it's mainly that message of no matter what background you have going into dietetics, every past experience you have can apply to a dietetics role, just because one, we can be in so many different there's so many different things you can do as a dietitian. And two, whenever it comes to like those soft skills or like, communicating, selling, I mean, especially for dialysis patients or, renal patients and things like that, they're in a super vulnerable time period. And so being able to have that strong communication, that strong marketing background to be able to encourage or motivate them to adhere to a certain meal, like kind of diet plan or adhere to their dialysis regimen and things like that, like those things are super important. And so to get into the meat and potatoes of dialysis and just things like that. So what made you specifically kind of like find dialysis or find renal as a dietitian once you finished your studies and things like that?
So you made a really good point, and like that is, everything is a learning experience. So it does not matter whether you're doing an internship or whether you have like a side job while you're in school, you're doing a volunteer opportunity. Everything is a networking opportunity, and every opportunity that you have or experience that you have is a learning opportunity. So I did get my first job through my internship. So my food service internship was with Wellspring in Greensboro. They were kind of branching out outside of just like the continuing care community aspect of their job. So they were also like a consulting business. Like they're kind of known as like the ritzy, like gold standard of continuing care communities. And so they were often hired as like consultants for other long-term care communities. So a continuing care community in Burlington, North Carolina, let their contract with Aramark lapse. They didn't want to use like their employees anymore. And so they hired Wellspring to kind of fill those positions. And so because I had made a good impression and I had really like, dive right in, and like even if it was the most boring job that I have ever done, which it was not, I am going to go in and have a positive attitude and act like I am just so happy to be there. If you ask me to do something, you say jump, I'm going to say how high. Like I am just going to be so excited about everything because you're learning something and you're making an impression. And so I got my job right out of school and started off at like a pretty competitive salary. So I loved long-term care as a job right out of school because it allowed me to get like a very broad idea of where you could specialize as a dietitian. So you saw a lot of different disease states. I saw like some, tube feedings here and there. I saw dialysis patients here and there. A lot of, knee replacements, like rehab patients, but you also had longer term stay patients, like skilled patients. And so you just saw a lot of different disease states and comorbidities. And I still was not necessarily interested in dialysis. I definitely was not interested in dialysis when I graduated from the nutrition program. I think I was more interested in like the sports nutrition side of things, but I kind of knew that like that's pretty niche and like you kind of need to have a full-time job and then kind of like consult with that until you can kind of make it your full-time job. So dialysis and renal was not something that I was like, I'm doing that one day. Because the diet's like very overwhelming and you're like, there's no rhyme or reason. And it just seems very daunting and very overwhelming to like even the practitioner. So I did what I always do, and I built connections. I think when I graduated from school, I think my class was like 15 people at the time. And so that was kind of that was my circle. So every time I met a dietitian, whether it was like communicating with dietitians at the local hospital or the dialysis community, I just made it my mission to like make a good impression, learn from them, coordinate with them, collaborate with them. And so I had communicated with some of the dialysis dietitians in the area quite a bit whenever we would get those patients. And so one of them called me up one day and she was like, we have a job opening. I think you would be a great fit. Like you're, super peppy, and like, here's the rundown of what the job is. And I think she sold it as she was a very good saleswoman as well. The first thing she said that hooked me was like, I'm not leaving the company, I'm moving up in position as a dietitian. And so I need someone to backfill me. And that was like number one. I was like, oh, I love that, because I was kind of feeling stagnant where I was. If I wanted to move up in long-term care, it was basically like a director of dining. I'd, done the hospitality thing. That was not something I was interested in. There was really no like room for lateral movement. It was like you were just kind of it. I also felt like my manager, who was the director of dining, so you're hired by the dining service crew, but you work more with like the clinical crew in long-term care. And so it was like my direct superior didn't necessarily see what I was doing every day. And so he didn't necessarily know like what I brought to the table or what my value adding like part of the job was. So I wasn't necessarily feeling like I had a lot of autonomy or like that it wasn't that I wasn't appreciated. It was just like they didn't know. Like it was, you don't know what you don't know. So she sold it to me as like, oh, you're basically like a glorified kindergarten teacher. Like you get to provide all this education and there are bulletin boards and you can give out prizes and candy. And I was just like, sounds great. And I wasn't necessarily looking for a new job at the time. I was not until kind of like you're presented with an opportunity like that, or you like, let me really step back and see what are my priorities in a job and what do I want out of a job? What do I want for my career? And where does that line up? And so I ultimately decided to take the leap, and I'm so glad I did, because I think like a year or two later, a lot of people who go into rehab now, they're sending them straight home with like home health. And so the census declined like quite a bit in at the continuing care community. And so they ended up like not needing like a full-time dietitian. It was more of like a dietitian that like goes to multiple facilities and travels a lot. And they even, I think, contracted a wing out to like the PACE program. And so I'm so glad that I made that decision, even though I didn't know it in the moment, because you never know until like 2 years later that you're like, thank goodness I made that decision. But I think it goes back to like following your gut, following, what are your priorities in a job? What is best for you? You can't really be afraid of hurting other people's feelings. You have to be a little bit selfish when it comes to you, your career, your happiness, and how fulfilled you are.
No, yeah, and I love how you said you and it makes sense, like once you spell it out, where it's like you have to be selfish towards your career because it's your career and no one else's. And kind of going back to that whole passion thing is you don't want to be doing something that, because like for example, if you didn't go back to nutrition, you would be doing like hospitality, tourism, or marketing, and you would have really just stuck with it because like you didn't want to let your parents down with like having to switch career, like switch a degree or things like that, or you didn't want to go to school for nothing, but then it's like you switched gears to nutrition because you wanted to, and then it just completely flourished into all of those great opportunities. And like as you were talking about like the networking and putting your all into all the people that you talk to, like you can really see that marketing background and just seeing that selling yourself part really coming through, which again, like you don't need to have a marketing degree per se to take good points from that. But I'm sure that those like things that you learned in undergrad really did help you like kind of go in with that attitude of, we're going to form a connection one way or another, and I'm going to leave like knowing your name, knowing what you do, and knowing ways that we can stay connected in the future, and just a whole lot of great stuff. And I think for sure that mindset also helped with, once you got that job in renal as like kind of filling in for that dietitian, going in that mindset, and like with what you said, that upward mobility, it was just a lot of opportunity. And so if I'm not mistaken, have you had like 3 progressive movements, or like how many position changes did you have you had in Davita? 3?
So I've been with Davita for 6 years in February, and I was a facility dietitian, and then I moved into a regional point dietitian role, and then a divisional lead role, and now a facility administrator role. So 3.
Yeah, and over like 6 years, that's really great, because like it's not like necessarily you're hopping from each role like super, super fast, but it's also not like drawn out. It's kind of like, you had a good amount of time in one role. Once you got comfortable with it, they kind of saw your potential and then was like, okay, well, let's see how you do in this role. And so you've had a lot of great like mobility and progression within Davita. And so what skills, and we kind of talked about the mindset that you've had before, just kind of going into whatever job you had, but what like skills or like mindset did you have going into Davita that really helped you kind of like really progress within the company that maybe someone listening could take some pointers or some cues from, so that they can maybe know what things to look out for if they want to progress in a company like that?
Honestly, I think it's just a positive attitude. So that has carried me so far. And I am like, to this day, like imposter syndrome, like to the max. Because I'm like, how did I get here? They're gonna know that I have no idea what I'm doing, right? But like, I've been acknowledged a lot in the company for just like my continued just like positive energy, right? Like I come into a room and I'm like, how is everybody? Like even if I'm not feeling the best, like I try to bring that to every situation, because it can be an overtly and like overwhelmingly depressing environment, and it doesn't have to be, right? Like we are, Davita literally means to give life, and so like we are giving life every day, and that's something to be positive about. People can become jaded with their job, and so number one, positive attitude, willingness to learn and like dive in and just kind of like be available and willing, right? As a manager now, I know how easy it feels, and like just how much relief I feel when I ask someone to do something and they just say yes, and there's like no strings attached to it. They're not, asking for more. It's like they're just willing to step in and help. And I feel like I've seen both sides, but I usually see a lot more people who are like, well, what's in it for me? Like, what am I going to get in return? And so being that person, I didn't realize it until later when it was like, hey, we have a vacancy. Like when I was a facility dietitian or even a regional point, like we have a vacancy at this facility. Like, would you mind helping cover it until we fill it? Sure. Tell me what you need. Like, I'm here for it. And I think that goes a long way. Now, there's a very thin line between overcommitting and like stressing yourself out, but saying yes to things like that, because you're going to get acknowledged for it, because managers appreciate when you say yes and what else can I do for you, because it's so rare and you don't realize that until like you're in a leadership position, how hard that is. So positive attitude, willingness to learn, willingness to dive in and like take on additional responsibilities when there may or may not be like an added incentive involved. And then I think just always learning, like just striving to learn, because the more you learn, the more power you have, and the more people you can help, and the more people you can support. And that goes a long way in corporate America, a mom and pop, like any industry that you go into or any business structure that you go into, it's going to serve you well.
Yeah, and I like how all of that really just ties into go in with an open mind and just go in being open. And I'm glad that you pointed out, like, yeah, there's that fine line between saying yes to everything and being like, yes, I'll clean, like I'll do everything all at once. But it's more so just like that unconditional wanting to help just to help. And that's, because like, for example, like when you get to spreading yourself so thin to where you're burnt out or overwhelmed, that's when it's like you get into that territory of you're saying yes based off of the condition of, oh, this will pay off, or like, oh, this will be worth it, or like, oh, I'll get something in return after this. Where it's like, if you just are more so unconditional and open, it'll be difficult to get overwhelmed, because you'll know when to say no and you'll know when to say yes, because
Right.
it'll be unconditional and it won't be just, oh, based off of these parameters I'll say yes, and based off of these parameters I'll say no. It's just
Right.
It'll be a lot more
Right.
intuitive and stuff. And I'm glad that you pointed that out, because someone might hear that and be like, oh, well, then I'm just going to get overwhelmed in 2 weeks because I'm pretty much just going to be my manager's personal assistant. But it's like, no, you're going to be proactive. You're going to be that attentive, ready to learn and just willing. It's more so being willing and open, and the
Right.
attitude, rather than, oh, checking all the boxes and being the one doing everything. And kind of going more into your like role in leadership and kind of your role with being in an interprofessional team, because in renal you're
Mm-hmm.
working with a lot of people other than dietitians, but a dietitian is definitely a crucial role in renal and dialysis.
Mm-hmm.
And so given that you're managing a team of a lot of different diverse like healthcare professionals, that requires, a lot of leadership skills, and not just leadership skills that are like pertinent to specifically dietetics, although that's definitely important. But whenever it came to developing those skills, or specifically looking at the things that you've learned in your leadership roles, what does that look like pertaining to, leading a team of people and the things that you've learned from it?
I think I've learned in this like leadership journey that there are so many different types of leaders, right? And there are different types of managers. We've all worked for them before, whether it's, in retail and like just like a part-time job or like a career. I think for me personally, and I remember a professor saying this to me. I forget which one it was, but I think it was in my quantity food production class. And like part of the semester, we were working in the dining hall. And I remember them saying, do not, like, you guys are getting a degree, right? Like, you are about to go into a kitchen and help people, assist people who may not have a degree. They are from rural North Carolina. You are not better than them. So, like, do not walk in there and think that because you're getting a degree that you know more. And, like, if you act that way, they are going to eat you alive. And I was like, yes, okay. And that really stuck with me because I feel like that's the person I am. So in terms of like my leadership journey, I think being willing to learn again and ask, because you're learning a lot. Like there were a ton of things as I moved into an FA role that I was not even aware of. Like we make bicarbonate acid every day that goes into people's bodies. You know what I mean? Like I had no awareness of that as a dietitian. I needed to educate myself. And to do that, I needed the help of those around me, regardless of education level, because they have more experience. So being able to go into every interaction, whether that's with a peer dietitian or an interdisciplinary team member or your nurses and your CNAs or patient care technicians on the floor, like they know so much and you can't just assume that like you know more than them. So that was one thing. It's like always stay humble, always stay grounded, always ask for help, always like take accountability if you're wrong, because you're gonna make mistakes. And once you kind of realize that, it's so much easier to own those mistakes instead of just trying to protect your ego and be like, I didn't say that, and deny. One thing I also loved about Davita is that they have programs, right, for you to bolster that skill set. So there was a class that I took that I was recommended for by my manager, which I feel like is also really important, is fostering the growth of others around you, whether that's like a peer dietitian or like a different specialty. She acknowledged, my contribution and recommended me for this class. And so we took it, and it was a 6-month class. You went like for a full day once a month, and every month you would read a different book, and that helped me tremendously. So it focused on things like coaching for performance, difficult conversations, which I feel like we all kind of struggle with, like as humans in general, but especially as dietitians, it can be hard to kind of confront that ambivalence with a patient or with a teammate. And so like learning how to have difficult conversations, you can still be firm but compassionate and care about the other person. It went over things like your emotional intelligence. So like bolstering your skill set in those areas about like how to be emotionally intelligent, how to have a difficult conversation, how to deliver feedback and take feedback in a way that is positive and adds value. All of those things made me super successful in my transition. And there's still things that I'm working on today. The biggest thing though that I can say, like, number one, helped me the most is motivational interviewing, like without a doubt. I had a counseling class in undergrad and I think grad school, but Davita also has like a program for dietitians that every dietitian has to take as a new hire that kind of like bolsters that skill set and like is like, okay, we're going to refresh. Like it might have been a while for you guys, like you've had a lot on your plate. We are going to refresh those counseling skills. And so it goes through the spirit of motivational interviewing, what motivational interviewing is, and then you have to like audio record yourself with patients, send them to a person that's been deemed proficient in motivational interviewing, like a fellow dietitian, and then you go over it, like what could have gone better, what went really well, and you learn how to use, like really use that skill set. And that by far has been one of the most useful skill sets that I have ever learned and like bolstered my experience with. It not only helps you in your personal life, but it helps you with patients, right? Like that's why they give it to you, is because you need to build rapport with a patient. We've all been in those situations where we are visiting a practitioner and we're, you know, sharing our concerns, and the practitioner is just like, well, here's what you need to do. Like, here's a medication, like, good luck. Instead of saying, well, what are you willing to do? Like, what do you think would solve the problem? What is the most important thing to you right now with your health? We're just not, as patients, we're not in the practice of talking a lot. The practitioner is, and motivational interviewing switches that, right? Like they should be doing a lot of the talking. They should be talking about the change they want to make and why they want to make it, because saying that out loud is going to make the likelihood of follow through that much greater. And so using that with patients obviously is a non-negotiable. Now, not every patient's going to be appropriate for that type of interaction, but using it with colleagues when maybe there's like a very like difficult interaction, maybe there's some tension, maybe like somebody says, like maybe you're working with your social worker, your scopes overlap a lot, maybe they think they don't need to do something, and the dietitian doesn't think it's within their scope, like it can help like diffuse tension. And then especially in like a management role, it 100% helps me every day have those difficult conversations that I was so afraid of having, like delivering feedback about performance or behavior. It's helped me tremendously in my personal life as well, because it just has allowed me to slow down, listen to what people are saying, actively listen to what they're saying, and respond in an appropriate way. Like I'm not responding or asking a question just to get a means to an end. I'm asking because I'm genuinely curious about, you know, how they feel and their perspective, so that I can reflect that to them, so that they feel heard and they trust me more and they're willing to like collaborate with me. So that by far has been the most useful set of skills that I've ever used in my leadership journey.
Yeah, and it's like there's so many good things that you mentioned, like, and just I feel like it goes hand in hand, being humble and motivational interviewing, because with motivational interviewing, you put you second and the person first, which automatically comes with being humble. And it's just, and also that's just such a translational skill set, where it's like, again, like with what you said, it is so beneficial just in all aspects. And I think it's good to point out, just for if people are listening, where it's like these are things where it's like, yeah, you can like read about it in a book, you can learn about it, but it's like you don't learn just by doing that, you also learn by doing. And so mainly this is kind of just that like kind of pivot for if you're struggling in these areas and you want to improve on them, these are like outlets or things that you can look to find activities or things to do to improve on it. Because I feel like, especially with
dietetics, you're always learning.
Exactly.
Right. Like you're always learning. Like just because someone is proficient in motivational interviewing doesn't mean they're perfect. Like it's a completely different cadence that you're using with someone else, and especially in roles that you are a leader but have no authority. So like in my regional point role, and even in my division lead role to some degree, you like the dietitian hierarchy within Davita is, the dietitian does not report to the regional point dietitian and the divisional lead dietitian. They report to their facility administrator, their FA. So when you're in a leadership role with no authority, because like I can't talk about a dietitian's performance and reprimand them, write them up, corrective action, like I can't do that. So it was imperative that I use those same skills, like the motivational interviewing skills and like the marketing skill set, to really sell ideas to dietitians about like how we should be doing things and initiatives that we're rolling out, because I didn't have the authority behind me to say like, if you don't do this, this will result in a corrective action for you. You don't have that on your side. And so motivational interviewing really like bridged the gap, where it was like, why are you feeling resistance towards this initiative? how can we get you to a place where you don't feel this resistance? And it's really about listening and responding in a way that is going to build rapport with them so that they trust that like what you're saying is right, but like you also have to put your ego aside as like the subject matter expert. You have to avoid what they call like the writing reflex, where like our natural tendency, because we want to help people, is to be like, you know, patients like, well, my phosphorus is high, and like I don't know why. Our natural reflex is to be like, well, it's probably, are you drinking colas? Are you eating chocolate? Is that what you're doing? You need to stop that. Like that's our natural response, because like we know. But if this person doesn't know where their next meal is coming from, like who am I? How tone deaf am I to sit there and say like, well, can you eat organic? You know what I mean? Like it's about listening and responding in a way that like they feel heard, because you might be doing more harm than good and like putting up a barrier if you're responding in a way that isn't in line with how they feel, or even a priority that they have. Like my priority could be to, you know, talk about lowering your phosphorus, but yours could be that your car doesn't start. And until we address that and get over that hurdle, you're not going to be in any like mental headspace to talk about your diet or, you know, what foods you want to eliminate. You know what I mean? So you're completely right. And it's useful in so many different areas.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned like that as well, where it's like you were more motivated to do motivational interviewing because you weren't in a place of authority. But I feel like that makes it was actually beneficial to have to shift more towards motivational interviewing to sell these ideas, or to encourage the person, whether it's your colleague, coworker, or patient, to adhere to a certain behavior, because then it's like you guys are a team working towards a goal, instead of them being held just pretty much against the shirt, being like, if you don't do this, then X, Y, and Z. It's a whole lot more resistance, whole lot more negativity, where again, if you go through it that way, it's a lot more positive. It's not me versus you, it's us against the problem type thing. And especially in a very emotionally charged environment like dialysis with the patients that you're dealing with, it's super important to go in with that mindset, instead of like with what you said, we want like dietetic students, and especially just like RDs in general, it's like we have all this knowledge, so we want to help as many people as possible. So we think just cutting to the chase is gonna, just get things fixed faster. But it's like you're dealing with another human who, you again, like you don't want to be tone deaf and not listen to that person and listen to the barriers that they may have to the solution that you're presenting, because the first thing is you have to dismantle those barriers to get to that solution. And so it's like you just mentioned so many great things, and especially that motivational interviewing. And as far as like just kind of expanding more on dialysis and renal. So you said that you started in long-term care and then you transitioned to dialysis. So as far as dialysis as a niche in dietetics, are there some big things that stand out that you don't really like notice or see in other fields of dietetics that would just be good things that people who may be interested in the field, or things that you would want aspiring RDs to know about dialysis in case they're interested?
For sure. I think the biggest thing that kind of like piqued my interest, besides the ability to grow, that was kind of like the number one thing for me, was like you're like the sky's the limit, right? Like you can move laterally, you can move up, you can also just like punch a clock if you want and go home. Like there's room for everyone. The other thing that stood out to me was like just the amount of autonomy that you have, the flexibility, the autonomy, and that you're regarded as a subject matter expert. Like the physicians are looking to you as a thought partner for specific parts of dialysis in like your recommendations, like the ability to adjust medications, the ability to call a pharmacy and call in those medications, the ability to, have a discussion about target weight, and like have people regard your word as like, oh, well, I had not thought about that. We don't get that as much in other areas. We don't really have we're so niche, like you said, that we don't really have the ability to kind of move around in terms of like management or, outside of our scope. But the autonomy to adjust medications, to, have those discussions, and like people are looking to you to report out on certain metrics because you own those. That was very alluring to me, and I thought it was very individualized to dialysis, because I had not really seen or heard any of my other peers who had like gone out into the workforce, like they were not seeing that as much. And so it was something for me, because my goal was to go as high as I could and move up and learn and like just, break the glass ceiling. That was something that really stood out to me, that I wanted to make sure I experienced and to like tell others about. And that was one of the reasons I got spoken to so many nutrition classes up at Appalachian, is because I felt like, myself included, in my class, I was like, that is not for me. Like I just had like that cursory glance of what a renal diet was, and I was like, it doesn't really jive with me. It doesn't sound like something I'd be interested in. But that goes back to like every opportunity you have, even if you think it's not like the most glamorous or exciting or challenging environment, and you're like, I know I won't like that, like at least try it, because you never know how it's going to fit, and you may end up somewhere where you never thought you would. And so that was what dialysis was to me, was like, I'm scared because I don't remember anything about it, but they teach you everything you need to know. So I was like, what do I have to lose besides the ability to like move up, gain a different skill set, specialize in something, like know a lot about something small as opposed to like a little bit about a wider variety of disease states. I kind of wanted to specialize in something and just know the ins and outs of everything about that niche. And so I think that makes dialysis kind of like stand alone, and that you're a subject matter expert, you're a core team leader, you're an integral part of the interdisciplinary team, and you're acknowledged as that within the dialysis setting. So
Yeah, and it's so rare to see that in other areas of dietetics. And I think it's so great how with dialysis, like with what you mentioned, what makes it so unique, and like I'm sure a reason why you gravitated so much to it is like just we really as RDs operate at the peak and height of our scope and with the things that we can do, and how we are the subject matter expert just because of how renal is and how integrated dietitians are in their treatment plan. And so given that there's just been a lot of struggle with having dietitians' voices heard, and like other niches are kind of being horizontal with other practitioners in that regard, especially with like patient care. And so what do you think about dialysis makes the RD it may be, super, like for some people it may be like, okay, well, yeah, it's obvious that an RD would be a subject matter expert. But there's also so many other niches in dietetics where we think it would be obvious, but then it's like we turn around and we're not seen as the subject matter expert. And so what do you think about dialysis makes us recognized as that subject matter expert? And what do you think about dialysis makes us able to operate like not beyond our scope, but at the height of our scope?
At the type, I think because honestly, you think back to what we're reimbursed for, right? Like, weight loss, kidney disease, and I think diabetes, right? Diabetes management. We can bill for that. And I think that's because like the government and the insurance companies have acknowledged that diet plays such an important role in preventing like these health catastrophes or these diagnoses that cost so much money. And so I think that was acknowledged first in the dialysis realm, kind of when they like already hit rock bottom. But I think studies have shown that the way that people have better outcomes, it's going to prevent hospitalizations, it's going to prevent those additional costs, even though they're already costing like quite a bit of money with just dialysis in general. I think the trend is growing with chronic kidney disease. So like preventative care and trying to get like on the other side of that, where they're referring patients to dietitians in like an outpatient setting to try to prevent the progression of chronic kidney disease because dialysis is so expensive. And so I think in this case, sadly, it's kind of because like the government and insurance companies have acknowledged that this is a way to prevent something way worse and way more expensive, and like just I mean, and just promoting a long life, right? Like dialysis is giving patients more moments because without it, they would not live. And so I think diet plays a big part in that. And I'm glad that it's been acknowledged, but I sadly think that like it kind of does come down to like the money and like the reimbursement and like all of that, because you don't necessarily see that type of response with like eating disorders, right? Or, you know, knee replacements or hip replacements. Like you're just not seeing that as much. Like this has become like its own entity because it's growing exponentially as a disease state, because of again the food that we eat. It's like just like this vicious cycle.
No, and I think it's good that you mentioned where it's like the reason why dietitians are able to operate at such, at the peak of our scope is because we are, you're able to use that leverage from insurance billing and just the money that is allocated for dietitians in renal and in dialysis. And it sucks that, we need that to be recognized. But I think a good thing to highlight is like the MNT Act that's kind of going on right now, that's looking to expand our like coverage into literally like 20 plus different like eating disorders included. And so I think what you mentioned is we see already in dialysis and in renal that dietitians are able to operate at such like a high scope of practice within dietetics is because we have that insurance and that billing as leverage. And so hopefully, fingers crossed, that we're able to get this passed as well, and then that'll lead other niches like with the eating disorders, with hypertension, with more weight loss, like there's going to be so many other areas where I feel like if and when, I mean it's really honestly a matter of time whenever we get the act passed,
right,
that will actually finally be billed, recognized, like it'll be the start of recognition in so many other niches. And I think it's great that you mentioned that in dialysis is already we already see firsthand, because that is covered under insurance and like Medicare and things like that, that's kind of a direct, not direct, but it is correlated with us having more recognition. And so it's a hopeful, optimistic, positive way
I
to think.
know,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah,
I
because
hate to generalize us too, but like we also like as a group, like we tend to also be, because the dietitian role now in renal is so different from even 5 years ago, and especially like 10 to 15 years ago. And I think that's because we've proven ourselves as like a population, because we do tend to be more like detail oriented. We know we do have like usually a strong work ethic, that has served us well because that's kind of like how we were taught. And I think we've kind of shown, like especially at Davita, it's like more keeps getting added to our plate, but in the best way possible, because like we've shown that we can do it. So when there's an initiative that rolls out that's like, we need like a quick turnaround, it's like, okay, give it to the dietitians, because like they will get it done. Like again, acknowledging that there's a gap and like being willing to fill it without the expectation of anything in return. I think that specifically as well has built up within the renal field, like our ability to specialize and to take things on, because we've shown that we are capable of doing that as a group. And I think that plays a lot into like who we are intrinsically, like we want to help, we want to provide, like we pay attention to detail because like we have to as part of our job. And I think that serves us well in this group as well, because it allows us to specialize and show that we can have that autonomy, we can like be trusted with that autonomy.
Yeah, and it's definitely the like show don't tell type thing where I mean like, and it kind of goes with like with what we said about motivational interviewing, where it's like it's not just telling the patient what to do, what to eat, how to eat, but you have to show them that you care about them, like you care about them first before any like ulterior thing that you want to subscribe or prescribe to them. And like it's just a great thing to keep in mind. And what's great is, again, it's like it's applicable to not just dialysis and renal, it's applicable to any role that you go into dietetics. And I think it's a great piece of advice that you mentioned for us, even like like yes, being able to be billed for insurance and being able to make more money off of renal and dialysis is very helpful in boosting that confidence to have, you know, a voice in the room and to be able to say more things. But it's not just exclusive to dialysis. Like you can, you know, show don't tell and show your worth and show your subject matter expertise in any field of dietetics, and it's not just exclusive to dialysis. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and how, because again, it's like I definitely feel like we're very scared to step outside of our small little box, but really the only way for us to have more recognition and more autonomy that, you know, a renal dietitian is able to have in other aspects of dietetics is to have the attitude of, I am, you know, I can operate at my highest level of scope in any field that I'm in. And I mean, like, you know, you'll get pushback from, you know, you always get pushback from other healthcare professionals and stuff. But if you have like that open mind, you know, like willing to listen and like motivational interviewing with other health practitioners, then that'll really help you kind of flourish in any role you're in dietetics. But yeah, I really, really love that emphasis of, you know, listen first. And then not, you know, it's like the conversation isn't a means to an end. Like you guys, you know, you want to work with the other person and things like that, and just a whole bunch of good stuff. And so, I'm glad that we've just been able to like not only talk about renal and dietetics and like renal dietetics specifically, but also just like the whole encompassing dietetics as a whole, because like, you know, renal is seen as like with what you said, it's very kind of not separate, but it is very specialized in dietetics because of insurance and things like that. But there's still a lot of great information, lots of great wisdom that no matter what role or where you're at in your dietetics journey, you can still learn a lot from renal and things like that. But so given the vastness of dietetics and given that there's so many different paths that someone can take, and renal, you know, just being one of them, what advice would you give current students or people pursuing the RD credential that are unsure of what specialty to pursue? You know, because you were similarly in that position where it was like you didn't really know that you wanted to do renal, and you were glad that you chose an option to specialize instead of just being, you know, kind of knowledgeable about a bunch of different things. And so what about those people who want to find a specialty, who really want to zero down on a specific niche in dietetics, but they want to make sure that they choose the right one, or they choose one that they're willing to drill down on?
Yeah, I think give every one of them a chance. Like, I think even the ones where you're like, that just sounds like I would rather eat glass, you know, like lean into it. Like, honestly, I've learned a lot in being uncomfortable, right? So putting yourself in those situations where you're going to feel uncomfortable because maybe it's not like within your skill set exactly, or maybe you think it's something that's like not going to, you know, ignite passion or whatever. I think leaning into that and giving every specialty a chance, if you can, is a great place to start, right? So I've known, you know, peers who were like, you know, I know I am meant to be an eating disorder dietitian. Like, I know I am meant to be that, and have gotten into that. And it's like some of them were right and they love it. And then some of them were like, I was so wrong. So like just having the self-awareness enough to know that it's like, I mean, it's like a wedding dress, right? Like, I think I know what I want, but like, I'm just going to try on a few and see like what tickles your fancy. And I think setting the bar kind of low and like not building up this specialty that you are just dying to pursue in your head, because like you very well may be suited, or you may fit something a little bit better that maybe you aren't willing to try because you just have tunnel vision. So I think kind of just being open and putting yourself in those positions, whether it's like reaching out to a specialty to like shadow a little bit, or doing like completing a volunteer opportunity that lets you kind of like dip a toe in and see what it's about. Like, just being willing to like put yourself in that situation. I think asking for mentors is something that like we don't do enough and can feel really uncomfortable, where it's like, hey, I really admire what you do. I love, you know, the path that you've taken. I'm interested in, you know, pursuing something similar. Would you mind mentoring me? I think like we don't do that enough, because a lot of people probably would be willing to do that. So kind of just putting yourself out there and putting yourself in the difficult situations that maybe you think like I'm not really well suited for that. And then again, diving into that and just like full, like feet first, like just do it. It's going to be uncomfortable, but rip the band-aid, because more likely than not, you're going to be glad that you did. And at least you had the experience, even if it is not a good experience and it doesn't fit for you, at least now you know, like, that's not the direction you want to go. And like, there's a lot of comfort in that, and knowing like, well, I don't have to wonder like if I woulda, shoulda, coulda have pursued that, because I already know that I know what I don't want. Now I'm closer to knowing what I do because I tried that.
Yeah, and I think there's such a, like, it's kind of unorthodox with the, it's like diving completely, headfirst into something. It's going to be uncomfortable. But then looking back on it, even if you hate it, you have comfort in knowing that you tried it and that you were able to fully embrace it. And again, I think there have been a lot of, recurring themes of being open, not having tunnel vision, fully embracing something, and just giving it your all. Because I mean, we saw how, with you had that mindset, that attitude, and that allowed you to progress in Davita, that allowed you to learn and really become a specialized practitioner in renal. And like, we were talking about this before the recording, where, you were like, because you gave lectures to our M&T class on renal and things like that, how at the beginning of the lectures and stuff, you had that imposter syndrome of, do I really know what I'm talking about? Do I really know things? But then you're like, now I'm at this point where I could go in with no slides and just talk about renal all day, every day. And just knowing, it's comfort and things like that for aspiring RDs to know that you do get to a point where you do know your stuff, you do find your niche, and you do specialize in something, or you don't, and like, but you discover that based off of experiences, based off of trying. Because again, it's like, you can dabble into all these specialties and not find one that you particularly want to zero in on, but because you dabbled in so many, you're like, okay, well, now I have this experience and confidence to start a private practice where I can help patients in all of these little things that I tried. And so there's really just, sky's the limit with dietetics. That's just like, and it's like,
growth is uncomfortable too. Like, I feel like everyone should like be comfortable with the fact that if you're growing, it's going to feel like you want to die, right? Like, it's not comfortable. Like, public speaking was not comfortable for me, but I purposefully put myself in those positions to become better at it and build that skill so that it wasn't as uncomfortable. Still uncomfortable, but definitely not as much as it was. And I've found a passion for like teaching and like helping and like sharing knowledge. And that's something I wouldn't have found had I not purposefully put myself in those situations. Same thing with leadership. Like, do not like having difficult, like negative conversations, but sometimes they need to be had. And what I've learned is if you're growing, you're gonna feel uncomfortable. And like, if you lean into that a little more, you're gonna be so glad you did, because that will ultimately become more comfortable. Like, I will never be fluent in like having difficult conversations like that, but I definitely am more willing to have them now than I was 6 months to even a year ago. And I acknowledge that having the difficult conversation early and in the moment is much easier and prevents a lot less heartache if you just kick the can down the road. And I feel like dietetics is the same way, where it's like, if you just dabble in it at the beginning, or you just jump in or lean into whatever's causing you some discomfort, you're probably going to be so glad that you did that, because you learned something. And just like the point you made, like, that's going to serve you better. Even if you don't end up in renal and you're doing like private practice, or maybe you're in the hospital, or maybe you're in an eating disorder clinic, like, you are one day going to run into a person that has chronic kidney disease or is in acute renal failure, and that you're going to be able to pull off that knowledge. So every experience is something that you can use to bolster your skill set, whether that's in counseling, in your knowledge base, like, all of it is something that you can use if you look at it that way. You just have to have that perspective.
Yeah, and I think a great thing to kind of like add on to that is, the more things that you experience and the more things that you dabble in, that I read this somewhere, I think it was on Instagram, where it's like, it increases your surface area of luck, in the sense of it increases those like opportunities of new doors opening, similar to you, where it was like, because of how much you had that go-getter attitude, and because you were so open and willing to trying new things, that was seen in that long-term care position. And you were able to get that door open in dialysis, where it's like, if you just go in with an attitude of, I want to learn, I want to do the best that I can, and I want to put my all into it, and you do that until you find, or like, you find that niche that you like, or you feel comfortable enough to maybe start a new growth thing of, starting private practice, or really kind of tying all those experiences together, that, like, again, it just increases that surface area of having a new opportunity show up, or having a new opportunity to grow a new skill. Like, it increases opportunity, and opportunity is where you get that growth. And we should chase towards it and not get uncomfortable. Like, discomfort's inevitable, but we shouldn't be scared of it or run away from it. But
yeah,
just so many great things. And so like, just as far as like closing thoughts or just final things, like, we covered so many great things. And what I like is that we just talk about, like, oh, what's your day-to-day as a renal dietitian, or like, what do you do to, like, what do you talk to patients about? It's just been a really great general, you don't have to know the ins and outs of renal to listen to this podcast. You can really just be like, what are good traits of a leader? How can I set myself up for success in any area of dietetics? How to operate at the peak of my scope. Like, we've really covered a lot of great things, and a lot of things that should get people excited about being a dietitian, just because of the, like, opportunities. But is there anything that you want to end on, or little pieces of advice, or just things that you would want people, if you were in the listener's shoes, things you would want them to know moving forward?
I think the reason I'm so glad that, like, we connected, and I'm so thankful for, like, these opportunities to get the word out there about renal nutrition in general. Like, we talked about this beforehand. Like, it was something I was not looking for. It was something I didn't think I'd be interested in. But as soon as I, like, took that chance, I fell in love with it, and I'm so passionate about it. And so I think part of the reason I like to share this knowledge, and I'm so excited about it, is because I feel like renal gets a bad rap sometimes. Like, I feel like the diet itself is very overwhelming. Like, there's no rhyme or reason, and there's this fear with it. It's like, how am I ever going to remember all this? But like we always are told, you don't have to know the answer. Like, of course you do with your exams and, like, your quizzes that you're being given, but, like, you're going to have, like, the reference ranges for the labs to translate the labs. If someone asks you about coconut oil and, like, how is that for a renal patient, like, you can look it up, like, it's gonna be there. So you don't have to know everything. Definitely, if this has piqued your interest at all, I would definitely suggest giving renal a try, because I feel like we need more people who are interested in it. Like, the population that is aging into, their chronic kidney disease, and soon their, like, end-stage renal disease, is only growing. And so, sadly enough, like, people are getting sicker and sicker, and ultimately, like, food is the reason, but, like, food is the answer. And I really think that there's going to be a huge need for both CKD dietitians and then end-stage renal disease dietitians. And so, if it's something that you feel like you might be interested in, I would wholeheartedly suggest giving it a try. If career growth and opportunity and management is something that you're interested in, like, it's a great place to be that will foster that growth. However, like, you just have to be willing to put in, like, that good faith kind of, like, action and experience before you're kind of gonna be rewarded with that. So, like, if you're asking the question in any job, if you're asking the question, like, what's in it for me, then that may not be the right job for you, right? Like, you want to feel enough passion and fulfillment to do the job. Like, I say this a lot, and I shouldn't say it to, like, my managers and everybody around me, but I'm like, I would do this job for free. Like, it's challenging to me. It's challenging. It's routine. It's flexible, but it also changes every day. And I love that about it. I love that every day I get to go in and, like, learn something new and, like, help make decisions, help give people life. And, like, that's the ultimate fulfillment that I think all of us really go into this field for, is, like, the ability to make people feel better and lengthen their life. And so, if any of that sounds interesting, I would just wholeheartedly suggest renal. But in general, I think going into your dietetic internship and your career, just be open, willing, and able, and then like ultimately humble and just curious, and like that's all going to serve you really, really well as you grow and learn. There's going to be a steep learning curve, but that's okay. Like lean into it.
Wow, if anyone was going to listen to one part of this episode, please have it be just the ending part of this.
Yes,
because
for
it was
sure.
yeah,
Like in a bow. Yeah.
like that was so
I know.
beautiful, so great, like best just note to end on. And I think it's just a great message overall, with so many great pieces of information that someone will at least be able to pull one thing from this interview. It's just one of the great things that you said. But thank you so much, Bennett, for just talking about your
Yes.
progression in Davita, your skills, just things that you've learned. There's so many great things that people can take from this episode, and I know people are going to love it. But just thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.